second talk of the session will be given by Cyrus, also about reconstructing trees.
Thank you. So this is joint work with Sammy Davies and Mickey Ratz from UW and Princeton, respectively. So the starting point for our work is the classic trace reconstruction problem on strings, where here there's an unknown string on n bits, and the goal is to recover it with samples from the deletion channel, where here each bit is deleted independently with probability half, and a sample looks like this, where you take a subsequence of the bits that remain and you concatenate them. So you lose all information about the positions of the deleted bits. And this process repeats, and you can get more samples. And eventually the question is, how many samples do you need to recover this unknown string, the labels of this string, with high probability? And this has been studied both in the theory algorithms community and also by coding theorists. And currently, the bounds are quite far apart. So the best upper bound that we know is that exponential and n to the 1/3 samples or traces suffice. And the lower bound is slightly superlinear, so about n to the 3/2 traces are necessary. So this is a really big gap, and the problem is that there's lots of correlation. So these deletions cause the samples to look very confusing. And practically, there's some motivation for this recently from DNA data storage and other computational biology problems, where the noisy copies, these traces, are noisy copies of some underlying strand of DNA, and the goal is to use as few as possible to recover the DNA. What we do is we look at a generalization of this problem to trees. So first of all, simply, instead of a string, you can think about having a rooted star on n leaves, and when the leaves are deleted, you keep the left to right order. So this is exactly the string case. And in general, we look at arbitrary trees, and we define what we call the tree edit distance deletion model. And here, the nodes are deleted with probability half, as before. But then what happens is that the children are going to move up to become children of the parents. So instead of concatenating the remaining bits left to right, instead we use the tree structure. And so we keep the left to right sort of planar embedding, but the children move up to become children of the parents. And as you notice in this example, binary trees do not necessarily stay binary. And so the goal here is to recover, so you know the structure of the tree, you know it's a binary tree, but you don't know the labels. And you want to ask how many samples do you need to recover all the labels on the nodes. And some motivation is that there are tree-structured DNA constructs. And so maybe this can be used for storage. And then also, theoretically, this is sort of a random tree that's close in tree edit distance. And really what I think is compelling about this question is that it gives a playground to study the interplay of both combinatorial and statistical methods for reconstruction problems. So we provide a bunch of results for different types of trees using different types of algorithms. For example, what we show, perhaps surprisingly, is that if you have a complete k-array tree, so think of k small like maybe a binary tree, then exponential and about k log n traces suffice. Which is to say that when k is a constant, this is only a polynomial number of traces. So somehow the structure of the tree immediately gives you a much easier problem than we know for the string case. For a large degree, we also get a similar savings, where exponential and about k to the 1/3 traces. And so here now, instead of the number of nodes n being the dominant factor in the exponent, really the degree is what controls the number of traces that we need, which again is fairly surprising. And so for both of these cases, there's regimes now where polynomial number of traces suffice to reconstruct complete k-array trees. And we also look at what are known as spider graphs. So here you have a bunch of paths that are sort of independent, but then you connect them at the same roots. And we show here this sort of complicated expression, but if it's exponential and n to the 1/3, again what we got for strings, but then there's an exponential savings of q, which is deletion probability, so think of that as like 1/2, to the d over 3. So basically, as the depth goes from 1 to log n, this interpolates from being exponential and n to the 1/3 to polynomial. So again, we get trade-offs that depend on the structure of the tree. So let me quickly give you a flavor of what the proofs look like here. So for the first theorem, we want to reconstruct complete k-array trees. So think about a binary tree. And the main idea is that we're going to reconstruct the labels for different subtrees independently and then put them all together. For example, consider this subtree of length of size d plus k, where d is the depth and k is the sort of number of leaves at the bottom. And the idea is that if the trace contains both the subtree and a couple other adjacent nodes, so a caterpillar, then the labels for these nodes are correct with good probability. And so what we can do is we can look at these traces and take enough of them so that we look at the ones that contain these caterpillars. And this happens with pretty good probability in the sense that since the dilution probability is constant, taking about exponential and k log n traces will suffice to see this caterpillar that we want. And then the claim is that with a little bit of technical massaging, you can actually recover the labels for this subtree. And you can repeat this for all the different subtrees which cover all the different nodes in the tree. And so somehow this is a very combinatorial view on what the reconstruction process looked like. And we also look at the spiders, as I said. And here the algorithms are actually going to be much more similar to what the state-of-the-art algorithms are for the string case. In particular, the string case algorithms right now are fairly naive, but also surprisingly powerful. So you take a bunch of these samples, and you just sum them up and take the average at each position. And what's been shown by previous work is that the average of some position can always distinguish any two strings with some reasonable probability. So like if you want to compare x1 and x2, you can look at some j position that depends on x1 and x2, and just that position will distinguish the two strings for you, and then you can just do a union bound over all pairs. And so we use a similar idea for spiders, but unfortunately, or interestingly, the generating function, which describes the process and what the actual means look like, is much more complicated. So it's essentially a two-dimensional generalization of what's been used for strings. And what was shown before and what we use is that this generating function can give you the expected distance between some average bits. And the main lemma is that there exists, we analyze this polynomial and we show that it's large by showing that there exists some point, which is going to be in the unit sphere or near 1, where this polynomial has a large modulus. And the size is going to depend on the bound we end up getting for the traces. And this shows us that we can distinguish two different spiders with some good probability if we take enough traces. And this is inspired by sort of classical results on the modulus of what are called Littlewood polynomials, and some recent results on a different variant of trace reconstruction. And it's basically a harmonic analysis proof. So what's kind of exciting also is that there's tons of open questions now. So we looked at two different types of trees, the complete trees and spiders. And one question is, can we reconstruct all trees with the same trace complexity as strings or better? And another question are there lower bounds? So the lower bounds for the strings don't seem to really apply to the trees, and maybe the tree structure can be used to prove much better lower bounds. And finally, there's a bunch of other variants of trace reconstruction that are interesting. So people have looked at, very recently, graphs or matrices, where you delete nodes of the graph, and you want to reconstruct the labels on the nodes. And people have also been trying to see if, instead of recovering a worst case tree or string, can we get an approximately correct solution with much fewer samples? So thanks, and if you have any questions, please see our poster tonight.
Few minutes. Yeah, it's hard to motivate myself to just yell across the room with one's questions. He'll be around at his poster.